Blood trickled down Francesca Harlow's face as she stumbled through the darkness, her vision blurring with each desperate step. The full moon of June 1875 cast an eerie glow across the dusty plains outside Silver Creek, Wyoming, illuminating her swollen features and torn dress as she fled the nightmare that had become her life. Francesca had believed Franklin Blackwater when he promised her safety, security, and love. The wealthy cattle baron's son had courted her with flowery words and expensive gifts, sweeping the 20-year-old seamstress off her feet during his business trip to San Francisco. Their hasty marriage 6 months ago had seemed like a dream until she arrived at the isolated Blackwater ranch and discovered the true nature of the family she'd joined. Worthless city girl, her mother-in-law had sneered earlier that evening as Franklin stood by silently. Can't cook proper, can't keep a house right, and 6 months without a baby in your belly. What good are you? Francesca had finally stood up for herself, telling them she wouldn't be spoken to that way. She never saw the first blow coming, Franklin's fist connecting with her jaw, knocking her backward. What followed was a blur of pain as his brothers joined in, her husband watching with cold eyes as they taught his wife her place. Now she stumbled through sagebrush, one eye swollen shut, ribs screaming with every labored breath. She had regained consciousness in the barn where they'd left her, gathered what little strength remained, and fled into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. A coyote howled in the distance. Francesca's legs finally gave out and she collapsed onto the hard, unforgiving ground. As consciousness began to slip away again, she heard the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats approaching. "Please," she whispered to the stars above, "not them. Anything but them." The hoofbeats slowed. Through her one good eye, Francesca saw a tall silhouette dismount from a horse. Rough hands, gentler than she expected, turned her over. "My God," a deep voice muttered. "What happened to you, madam?" Francesca couldn't answer before darkness claimed her again. Xavier Young had been tracking a mountain lion for 3 days. The rancher from the next county had hired him to hunt down the predator that had been killing livestock, and Xavier was the best tracker in 3 territories. At 32, he'd earned his reputation honestly, first as a scout during the war, then as a lawman for a spell, before settling into life as a solitary hunter and occasional ranch hand. He hadn't expected to find a beaten woman on his trail. As he gently lifted her unconscious form onto his horse, he took note of her fine, if tattered, clothing. This was no common traveler or working girl. Someone had deliberately done this to a lady, and the thought made his blood boil. "Easy now," he murmured, more to himself than to her as he mounted up behind her, cradling her limp body against his chest. His cabin was a half-day's ride back, but he knew a place closer, an old line shack where he sometimes stayed when working this range. When Francesca next opened her eye, she found herself on a narrow cot in a small, rustic cabin. A lantern cast shadows across rough-hewn walls. Pain radiated through her body as memories flooded back. "You're awake," came a voice from the corner. Francesca startled, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of agony through her ribs. A tall man with broad shoulders moved into the light. He had dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, a strong jawline covered in stubble, and eyes the color of a summer storm, gray with flecks of blue. He wore simple trail clothes, dusty from travel. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice low and steady. "Name's Xavier Young. Found you half dead on the plains. You're safe here." Francesca tried to speak, but her throat was parched, her lips cracked and swollen. Xavier moved slowly, like one might approach a wounded animal, and offered her a tin cup of water. When she struggled to sit up, he gently supported her shoulders, helping her drink without a word. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "You want to tell me who did this to you?" Xavier asked, his tone neutral though his eyes hardened. Francesca looked down at her bruised hands. "My husband, his family." Xavier's jaw clenched. He'd seen his share of cruelty in this world, but violence against women ranked among the worst in his estimation. "You got a name?" he asked after a moment. Francesca Harlow." She deliberately used her maiden name, unwilling to claim the Blackwater name any longer. "Well, Miss Francesca, you've got some bad bruising, maybe a cracked rib or two. I've seen worse, but not much. You need rest." He stood, towering in the small space. "I'll be outside. Cabin's got one room, and I reckon you'd feel better with some privacy." Before she could respond, he ducked through the low doorway, leaving her alone with her thoughts and pain. Xavier leaned against the rough exterior wall of the lined shack, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. The woman inside troubled him. Not just her injuries, though those were bad enough, but the hollow look in her eye, like something fundamental had been broken. He'd seen that look before in soldiers who'd seen too much death, in settlers who'd lost everything to raids or disease. He should take her to town, find the marshal, report what happened. That would be the proper thing to do, but something told him this situation wasn't that simple. Women who ran from their husbands rarely found justice in a court of law, especially if the husband came from money or influence. Inside the cabin, Francesca gingerly explored her injuries. Her face felt misshapen, swollen beyond recognition. Every breath sent stabbing pain through her left side. Bruises in the shape of handprints marked her arms. But she was alive, which seemed miraculous given how the evening had progressed. She thought of Franklin's face as he watched his brothers kick her dispassionate, as though observing cattle being branded. In 6 months of marriage, she'd watched him transform from the charming, attentive man who courted her to a cold, controlling stranger. Tonight had merely been the culmination of a darkness she'd glimpsed in flashes in his cutting remarks, in the way he gripped her arm too tightly in public, in how he isolated her from making friends in town. The door creaked open, and Xavier ducked back inside, a bundle of cloth in his hands. "Found these in my saddlebags," he said, setting down a worn but clean shirt and trousers. "They'll swallow you whole, but they're better than." His eyes flicked to her torn, blood-stained dress. "Thank you," Francesca said, "for everything." "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Xavier nodded once. "You hungry? Got some jerky and beans, not much of a cook." Despite everything, Francesca felt a faint smile tug at her lips. "Neither am I, apparently." It was one of many complaints. Xavier's expression darkened momentarily before he busied himself with the small cast iron stove in the corner. "Most men I know can feed themselves just fine. Seems a poor reason to." He trailed off, not finishing the thought. While he worked, Francesca changed into the offered clothing, moving slowly to minimize the pain. The shirt hung to her knees, the trousers impossible to keep up even when cinched tight with a piece of rope. Still, the clean fabric felt like a blessing against her battered skin. They ate in relative silence, a simple meal of beans warmed over the fire and tough jerky softened in the bean broth. Francesca could only manage a few bites, her jaw too sore for much chewing, but the food and water revived her somewhat. "Your husband," Xavier finally said, setting aside his empty plate. "He'll be looking for you." Francesca stared into the small fire. "I don't know, maybe, if only to punish me for running." "You got family elsewhere, somewhere to go." She shook her head. "My parents died in a fire 2 years ago. I worked as a seamstress in San Francisco before I met Franklin." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "First light, I can take you to Silver Springs. It's about 40 miles east. Sheriff, there's a fair man." Or there's Riverton to the west, but that's Blackwater territory, if I'm guessing right about your husband." Francesca's heart raced at the mention of the name. "How did you— Not many families around here capable of this kind of brutality without consequence," Xavier said grimly. "Blackwaters own half the territory and most of the men with badges in it." Fear crawled up Francesca's spine. "Then nowhere is safe. They'll find me. Not if you get far enough away." Xavier studied her for a long moment. "I'm heading to Colorado when I finish this tracking job. Few weeks' ride. Got business in Denver. You're welcome to travel with me that far." Francesca looked up sharply, surprised by the offer. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Xavier's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered in his gray eyes. "Known enough men who treat women like property. Never sat right with me." He stood, gathering their plates. "You don't have to decide now. Get some rest." That night, Xavier slept outside beneath the stars despite Francesca's protests that she could manage on the floor. She lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness and contemplating her future or lack thereof. Franklin would indeed search for her. His pride wouldn't allow his wife to escape, to potentially spread stories about the family's cruelty. And the Blackwaters had connections throughout Wyoming territory. By morning, her decision was made. Xavier was already awake, tending to his horse when Francesca emerged from the cabin. The early light illuminated her injuries in stark relief, and Xavier winced internally at the sight. "I'd like to accept your offer," she said without preamble. "To travel with you to Denver." Xavier nodded once. "We'll need supplies, and to finish my job first. That cat's still out there killing stock." "I understand. I can help however I'm able." "You can help by healing up," he replied. "Can't travel far in your condition." They remained at the line shack for 3 more days. Xavier left each morning to continue tracking the mountain lion, returning by sunset with fresh game and news of his progress. Francesca, despite her injuries, insisted on contributing. She mended Xavier's spare shirt with needle and thread from his saddlebags, kept the cabin tidy, and by the 3rd day felt strong enough to prepare simple meals from their limited stores. They spoke little during this time, existing in a careful, polite arrangement that suited them both. Xavier was naturally taciturn, and Francesca found comfort in the silence after months of critical commentary from her in-laws. Still, she observed her rescuer closely, noting his methodical habits, the way he always cleaned his rifle before eating, how he moved with efficient grace despite his large frame. On the 4th day, Xavier returned to the cabin earlier than usual, his expression grim but satisfied. "Got the cat," he said simply, unpacking his saddlebags. "We can head out tomorrow if you're feeling up to it." Francesca nodded. Her face had begun to heal, the swelling receding enough that she could now open both eyes. The bruises had turned a sickly yellow-green, but the pain in her ribs had subsided to a dull ache. "Where will we go first?" she asked. Xavier spread a worn map on the small table. "Need to collect my payment from the Hendricks Ranch, then we'll head south toward the Colorado border. Best to avoid settlements where Blackwater might have eyes." Francesca's stomach tightened at the name. "Do you think they're searching for me?" Xavier's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were kind. "Hard to say. Depends how much they care about keeping up appearances." That night, as they prepared for sleep, Xavier again insisting on staying outside despite the coolness of the evening, Francesca finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. "What will happen when we reach Denver?" Xavier paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. "That depends on you, I suppose. It's a big city. Opportunities for a fresh start. And you," she pressed. "What business takes you there?" Something crossed his face, a flicker of an emotion Francesca couldn't quite identify. "Old promises," he said finally. "Nothing that need concern you." Before she could respond, he ducked outside, closing the door firmly behind him. The journey to the Hendricks ranch took most of the next day. Xavier insisted Francesca ride his horse while he walked alongside, leading the animal by the reins. They traveled across open country, avoiding the main trails where possible. By mid-afternoon, they crested a rise overlooking a modest ranch house, nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills. Smoke curled from the chimney and cattle dotted the surrounding pastures. "Wait here," Xavier instructed, helping Francesca dismount in a small copse of trees. "I'll collect my payment and see about getting supplies. Best if fewer people see you." Francesca nodded, understanding the caution. Her bruises were still visible, her face recognizable to anyone who might be looking for Franklin Blackwater's missing wife. Xavier returned an hour later with saddlebags full of supplies, and a second horse, a sturdy bay mare with gentle eyes. "Hendricks threw in the horse as part of my payment," he explained, though Francesca suspected this wasn't entirely true. "We'll make better time with both of us riding." They camped that night beside a small creek, far from any established trails. Xavier built a small, smokeless fire and showed Francesca how to set up a simple shelter using a canvas tarp from his supplies. As they shared a meal of salt pork and hardtack, Francesca studied her companion across the flames. In the firelight, his features seemed both harder and more vulnerable somehow. "How did you learn to track?" she asked, breaking their comfortable silence. "Were you always a hunter?" Xavier took his time answering, chewing thoughtfully. "Was a scout during the war. Before that, learned from my father who trapped and hunted to feed us." "You fought for the Union," he nodded once, "and after the war, drifted west. Tried my hand at ranching for a spell, did some work as a deputy down in Texas." His expression closed slightly. "Found I preferred the freedom of hunting and tracking, fewer complications." Francesca sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. They all had pasts they preferred not to dwell on. "What about you?" Xavier asked unexpectedly. "How does a San Francisco seamstress end up married to a Wyoming rancher?" Francesca looked down at her hands, absently tracing a healing cut across her palm. "Franklin was in San Francisco on business. He came to the shop where I worked to order suits. He was different then, charming, attentive." She shook her head ruefully. "I was flattered by his attention. After my parents died, I was so alone. When he proposed after just 3 weeks, it seemed romantic rather than rushed." "And when did things change?" Xavier's voice was neutral, but his eyes were intent. "The moment we arrived at the ranch," Francesca said softly. "It was like a mask slipped away. His mother took one look at me and declared I would never be good enough for her son. Franklin, he changed, started criticizing everything I did, wouldn't let me go into town alone. Said I embarrassed him." Her voice faltered. "I told myself it would get better once we settled in, once I learned how they liked things done." "It's not your fault," Xavier said firmly. "Men like that, they're broken inside. Nothing you could have done would have fixed him." Francesca looked up, surprised by the vehemence in his normally measured tone. "You sound like you speak from experience." Xavier's jaw tightened. "My sister married a man like that. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late." The simple statement hung in the night air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. "I'm sorry," Francesca whispered. Xavier nodded once, then rose to his feet. "Should get some rest. We've got a long ride tomorrow." The next several days fell into a rhythm. They would rise with the sun, break camp efficiently, and ride until dusk, avoiding main trails and settlements. Xavier proved to be a patient teacher, showing Francesca how to care for her horse, how to read the land for water sources, how to move without leaving obvious tracks. Her strength returned gradually. The pain in her ribs subsided to a dull ache, and the visible bruises faded. More importantly, something inside her began to heal, a spark of independence rekindling after months of being smothered under Franklin's control. They were 4 days into their journey, camped in a sheltered canyon, when Xavier finally broached the subject they'd been avoiding. "We need to discuss what happens if we encounter trouble," he said, cleaning his rifle by the firelight. "Blackwaters have connections. Might have men looking for you." Francesca's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "What should we do? If anyone asks, you're my sister. We're heading to Denver to visit our ailing father." He hesitated. "Might need to change your appearance some, your hair especially, it's distinctive." Francesca touched her long auburn hair, one of the few features she'd always been proud of. Franklin had forbidden her to cut it. "I understand," she said quietly. Xavier studied her face. "Doesn't have to be permanent. Just until we're safely in Colorado." The next morning, Francesca used Xavier's hunting knife to cut her hair to just below her ears. The weight that fell away felt symbolic somehow, and when she caught her reflection in the small mirror Xavier carried for shaving, she hardly recognized herself. The short, uneven locks framed her face differently, emphasizing her high cheekbones and large green eyes. When she emerged from behind the boulder where she'd sequestered herself for the task, Xavier looked up from saddling the horses. For a moment, he simply stared, his expression unreadable. "Well," Francesca asked nervously, "will it help with our disguise?" Xavier cleared his throat. "Yes. Looks good." Something in his tone made warmth spread through Francesca's chest, a sensation so unfamiliar after months of criticism that she almost didn't recognize it as pleasure. They rode south through increasingly rugged terrain, the mountains looming larger on the horizon each day. Xavier seemed to relax slightly as they put more distance between themselves and Blackwater territory. And Francesca found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noting the rare smiles that softened his weathered features, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. On the 7th day of their journey, they encountered their first test. They had stopped to water the horses at a small stream when the sound of approaching riders reached them. Xavier immediately motioned for silence, leading their horses into a thicket of cottonwoods. "Remember," he whispered, "you're my sister, Frances. We're visiting our father." 4 riders appeared along the stream, rough-looking men with the dust of long travel on their clothes. They dismounted to water their horses, and Francesca's heart nearly stopped when she recognized one of them as Jensen, the foreman from a neighboring ranch that often did business with the Blackwaters. Xavier straightened, adopting an easy posture as he stepped out of the trees, gesturing for Francesca to follow. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called. The men turned, hands instinctively dropping to their holsters before relaxing slightly at the sight of Xavier's casual stance. "Afternoon," the oldest of the men replied. "Don't mean to intrude on your water." "Plenty for everyone," Xavier said with a nod. "Me and my sister are just passing through, heading to Denver." Jensen studied them, his gaze lingering on Francesca. She kept her head slightly down, heart hammering in her chest, grateful for her altered appearance and the still fading bruises that further disguised her features. "Denver's a fair piece from here," Jensen commented. "You two alone?" "Just us," Xavier confirmed, his tone remaining pleasant, though Francesca noticed how he subtly shifted to place himself between her and the men. "Our father's taken ill. Asked us to come." Jensen nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Francesca again. "Your sister seems familiar somehow. You folks ever pass through Riverton?" Can't say we have, Xavier replied. Francis here hasn't been west of the Mississippi before this trip. Have you, sister? Francesca shook her head, keeping her eyes downcast. No, she said softly, disguising her voice as best she could. This is my first time. An uncomfortable silence stretched between the groups until the oldest rider cleared his throat. Well, we should push on. Got a ways to go before nightfall. You men heading north? Xavier asked conversationally. Yeah, Jensen answered. Looking for a woman, actually. Rancher's wife went missing about a week back. Foul play suspected. You haven't seen any lone women on the trail, have you? Francesca's blood ran cold, but Xavier didn't miss a beat. Can't say we have. What's this woman look like? We can keep an eye out. Pretty little thing, Jensen said. Auburn hair down to her waist, green eyes, might be injured, her husband's worried sick. That's so. Xavier's tone remained neutral. What happened to her? Jensen exchanged glances with his companions. Reckon she was taken, maybe by Indians, maybe by drifters. Her husband found signs of a struggle. Terrible business, Xavier said, shaking his head sympathetically. Hope you find her. The men remounted their horses and Jensen tipped his hat. If you do see anything, Blackwater Ranch in Riverton would be mighty grateful for information. There's a reward. We'll keep that in mind, Xavier assured them, watching as they rode away north. Only when the riders had disappeared from sight did Francesca release the breath she'd been holding, her hands trembling. He suspects something, she whispered, panic rising in her throat. Jensen knows me. He's been to dinner at the ranch. Xavier's expression was grim. Maybe. But he can't be sure. Your appearance is different enough. He began quickly gathering their belongings. We should move on, though, find somewhere less exposed to camp tonight. That evening, they made camp in a secluded box canyon, the entrance narrow enough that they could hear anyone approaching. Xavier was quieter than usual as he prepared their meal, his movements tense, his gaze frequently scanning their surroundings. They're saying I was taken, Francesca finally said, breaking the heavy silence. Franklin's lying about what happened. Xavier nodded, unsurprised. Easier than admitting the truth. Man like that, his pride wouldn't allow it. I'm putting you in danger, she realized suddenly. If they find us together, they'll assume you kidnapped me. Let them assume, Xavier said flatly. Wouldn't be the first false accusation I've faced. Francesca studied his profile in the firelight. What do you mean? Xavier was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. After the war, I went home to Tennessee, found my sister in a bad marriage, like I told you. Her husband was the son of the local judge, respected family. When I tried to help her leave, he accused me of crimes I didn't commit. His father made sure the charges stuck. Xavier's jaw tightened. I served 3 years before another judge reviewed the case and released me. By then, my sister was dead. Accident, they called it. Francesca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. I'm so sorry, Xavier. He shrugged, but the movement was stiff. It was a long time ago, but I learned something about men with power and how they use it. Your husband, he'll have a story that protects him, no matter what really happened. And if they catch us? She asked quietly. They won't, Xavier said with quiet certainty. But if trouble comes, you run. Don't look back. Get to Denver, find the Sisters of Charity Mission. They help women in your situation. The next morning, they left before dawn, riding harder than before. Xavier altered their course, leading them through more difficult terrain where pursuit would be challenging. They spoke little, both lost in their own thoughts, the encounter with Jensen having shattered their growing sense of security. That evening, as they made camp in a cave overlooking a narrow valley, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Lightning split the sky, followed by crashes of thunder that echoed off the stone walls. Rain fell in sheets, turning the ground outside their shelter to mud. Xavier built a small fire near the cave entrance, where the smoke could escape, but the flames were shielded from view. They sat close together for warmth, the temperature dropping rapidly with the storm. "We should reach the Colorado border in 2 days, weather permitting," Xavier said, watching the rain. "Things will be easier then. Blackwater's influence doesn't extend as far south." Francesca nodded, drawing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What will you do in Denver, really?" she asked, returning to the question he had dodged before. Xavier was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "There's a man there. Lawyer. He was looking into my sister's death before I was released from prison. Said he had evidence that could bring her husband to justice." He glanced at her. "I've been tracking him for nearly a year. He moves around a lot." "You want revenge," Francesca said softly. "It wasn't a question." "I want justice," Xavier corrected, though his eyes were hard. "There's a difference, is there?" she asked, thinking of Franklin and the anger that sometimes burned in her chest when she remembered his cold eyes watching as his brothers beat her. "Has to be," Xavier replied. "Otherwise we become what we hate." They fell silent, listening to the storm rage outside. Francesca found herself studying Xavier's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way his mouth sometimes softened when he looked at her. She had known him barely 2 weeks, yet she trusted him more completely than she had ever trusted Franklin. "I never thanked you properly," she said suddenly, "for finding me, for helping me." Xavier looked at her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "No need for thanks." "There is," she insisted. "You could have left me there or taken me to a town and washed your hands of the situation. Instead, you've risked yourself to help a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore," Xavier said quietly. Something in his tone made Francesca's heart quicken. They were sitting close, shoulders nearly touching, and she became acutely aware of his proximity, the clean scent of him beneath the trail dust, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his hands, so capable of violence when needed, had been unfailingly gentle with her. A particularly loud crack of thunder made her start, and Xavier instinctively put his arm around her shoulders. The gesture was protective rather than presumptuous, but Francesca found herself leaning into his warmth, her head coming to rest against his shoulder. They remained that way for a long moment, neither speaking. Francesca felt Xavier's slight hesitation before his arm tightened fractionally, drawing her closer. "Should try to get some rest," he eventually said, his voice rougher than usual. "Long ride tomorrow." Francesca nodded but didn't move immediately. "Xavier, when this is over, when we reach Denver, I'd like to help you. With finding the lawyer, I mean." Xavier looked down at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Why would you do that?" "Because you helped me when I needed it most," she said simply. "And because I understand what it's like to need closure." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then Xavier gently disentangled himself, rising to check that their horses were secure for the night, leaving Francesca with the lingering warmth of his touch and a confusing swirl of emotions. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, slowing their progress considerably. The mountain trails became treacherous with mud, forcing them to lead the horses on foot through the worst sections. By midday, they were both soaked through and chilled despite their oilskin coats. "There's an old mining town a few miles ahead," Xavier said as they paused to rest in the shelter of an overhanging cliff. "Mostly abandoned now, but there might be some buildings intact enough to provide better shelter than we'll find out here." Francesca nodded, too cold to argue. Her hands were numb, her wet clothing clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The thought of a roof, walls, and possibly a fire was too tempting to resist. The mining town appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the mountainside. Most were in various states of collapse, but a few structures near the center of town seemed reasonably intact. They approached cautiously, Xavier's hand resting near his holster as they rode down the muddy main street. No signs of recent habitation were visible. The place had the hollow, abandoned feeling of a settlement long forgotten. Over there, Xavier pointed to what had once been the assayer's office, according to the faded sign above the door. Looks solid enough. Inside, they found a single room with a stone fireplace, dusty but dry. Rotting furniture had been pushed against one wall, but the roof was intact and the stone chimney appeared sound. "Stay here," Xavier instructed, helping Francesca dismount. "I'll check the rest of the town, make sure we're alone, then take care of the horses." While he was gone, Francesca busied herself clearing debris and preparing the fireplace. By the time Xavier returned, leading their horses to shelter in a lean-to attached to the building, she had a small fire started using dry wood she'd found stacked in a corner. "Town's empty," Xavier reported, removing his dripping hat. "Has been for years, looks like." Silver played out, everyone moved on. He reached into his saddlebags and produced a bottle of whiskey. Found this in what used to be the saloon, thought it might help ward off the chill. Francesca accepted the bottle gratefully, taking a small sip that burned a path of warmth down her throat. "We should hang our clothes to dry," she suggested, suddenly aware of how her wet dress clung to her form. Xavier nodded, turning away to give her privacy. "I'll unsaddle the horses. Back in a few minutes." When he returned, Francesca had removed her outer clothing and wrapped herself in a blanket, arranging her dress and petticoat near the fire to dry. Xavier similarly shed his wet coat and shirt, hanging them from nails on the wall. In his undershirt, the breadth of his shoulders was more apparent, as was the lean strength of his arms. Francesca found herself looking away, a flush warming her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire or whiskey. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, huddled near the fireplace as rain continued to drum on the roof. The whiskey helped ease the chill, and Francesca felt herself relaxing as warmth gradually returned to her limbs. "How did you learn to track?" she asked, returning to a question she'd asked days earlier but felt he hadn't fully answered. "You said your father taught you, but it seems like more than that." Xavier took another sip of whiskey before answering. "My mother was Cherokee," he said after a moment. "She taught me to read the land, the sky, the animals, how to move without being seen, how to find water in dry country. My father added what he knew from trapping and hunting." Francesca studied his features with new understanding: the high cheekbones, the straight black hair now streaked with silver at the temples. "That's why you understand so well what it means to be an outsider." Xavier's eyebrows rose slightly. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk about power, about justice," she explained. "It's not theoretical for you, you've seen both sides." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perceptive." "Tell me about your mother," Francesca prompted, drawn to this glimpse of his past. Xavier's expression softened. "She was strong, stubborn. Had to be, to marry a white man in Tennessee before the war. Taught school on the reservation when I was young until the authorities decided Indian women shouldn't be educating children, even their own." His jaw tightened. "Died of tuberculosis when I was 15. "I'm sorry," Francesca said softly. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Xavier passed the whiskey bottle back to her. "Your turn. Tell me something real about Francesca Harlow, not Franklin Blackwater's wife." Francesca took a small sip, considering, "I've always loved creating things. Before I was a seamstress, I used to draw. Landscapes, mostly. My father thought it was a waste of time, but my mother encouraged it, said I saw beauty others missed." "You still draw?" She shook her head. "Franklin thought it frivolous, said a rancher's wife had better uses for her time." Xavier's expression darkened. "Man sounds like a fool as well as a brute." "He wasn't always," Francesca said, though the defense felt hollow even to her own ears. "Or perhaps he was, and I was simply too naive to see it." "Love blinds us sometimes," Xavier said quietly. "Makes us see what we want to see." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Francesca felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. In the flickering firelight, Xavier's face seemed both stronger and more vulnerable than usual, the hard lines softened by shadow. "Do you think," she began, then hesitated. "Think what?" "You think people can change, truly change who they are?" Xavier considered the question seriously. "I think we can choose our actions even when our instincts pull us elsewhere. Whether that's change or just control, I don't know." Francesca nodded, thinking of the anger she sometimes felt stirring inside her when she remembered what Franklin had done, the desire for retribution that occasionally surfaced in her darkest moments. "I worry sometimes," she admitted in a near whisper, "about what I might do if I ever saw him again." Xavier's gaze was steady. "Thinking about something isn't the same as doing it. We all have darkness in us. The choice is whether we feed it or fight it." The simple wisdom of his words resonated with something deep inside her. Impulsively, she reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, a working man's hand. Xavier looked down at their joined hands, then back up to her face. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding and something more. For a breathless moment, Francesca thought he might lean forward, close the distance between them. Instead, he gently turned his hand to squeeze hers once before releasing it. "Should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Storm might break by morning." The next day dawned clear, the storm having blown itself out overnight. They set out early, their clothes dried by the fire and their spirits somewhat restored by the night's rest. As Xavier had predicted, they crossed into Colorado territory by late afternoon, marked by nothing more dramatic than a weathered signpost at a trail junction. Still, Francesca felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They were beyond Blackwater's immediate reach now, and Denver was only days away. That evening, as they made camp in a pine forest, Xavier seemed preoccupied, repeatedly scanning their back trail with his spyglass. "Is something wrong?" Francesca finally asked as he returned from yet another check of their surroundings. Xavier frowned, putting away the glass. "Not sure. Thought I saw dust on the horizon earlier. Could be nothing. Could be riders." Francesca's heart quickened. "Jensen and his men, or ordinary travelers," Xavier pointed out, though his expression remained troubled. "Either way, we should be careful. No fire tonight." They ate a cold supper and prepared for an uncomfortable night. Without a fire, the mountain air quickly grew chilly, and Francesca found herself shivering despite her blanket. "Here," Xavier said, noticing her discomfort. He removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The garment was warm from his body and carried his scent: leather, tobacco, and something uniquely him. "But you'll be cold," she protested. Xavier shrugged. "I've slept in worse conditions." They settled side by side against a large pine, using its trunk as a backrest. Despite her exhaustion from the day's ride, Francesca found sleep elusive, her mind racing with thoughts of pursuit, of Denver, of the man beside her. "Xavier," she whispered, uncertain if he was still awake. Came his low response. "What will happen when we reach Denver?" He was silent for a long moment. You'll be safe there. Big city, plenty of opportunities for a skilled seamstress, or whatever else you might want to do. And you, after you find this lawyer, another pause. Haven't thought that far ahead, never do much. Francesca turned slightly to study his profile in the moonlight. Is that why you never settled anywhere? Always tracking, hunting, moving on. Xavier's mouth quirked in a half-smile. That obvious, just an observation, she said softly. He sighed, his breath visible in the cool night air. After what happened to my sister, didn't see much point in putting down roots. Easier to keep moving. Easier to avoid attachments, Francesca suggested gently. Xavier looked at her then, his gray eyes serious in the moonlight. Maybe, he acknowledged. What about you? What do you want once you're safe? The question caught Francesca off guard. For so long her wants had been subsumed by survival, by the need to please Franklin and his family, by the desperate flight from them. What did she want? Freedom, she said finally. To make my own choices. To create again, so whatever calls to me, to not be afraid. She hesitated, then added quietly, to be seen for who I really am, not who someone wants me to be. Xavier nodded slowly. Worthy aims. And impossible, perhaps, she added with a sad smile. I'm still legally bound to Franklin. Even in Denver, I'll be a married woman in hiding. Laws can be changed, Xavier said, or circumvented. Are you suggesting I simply pretend to be unmarried? Francesca asked, surprised by his pragmatism. I'm suggesting you do what you need to for your safety and happiness, Xavier replied. The law doesn't always protect those who need it most. They fell silent, each contemplating the complications that lay ahead. Eventually, Francesca felt her eyelids growing heavy, the day's exertions finally catching up to her. Without conscious thought, she found herself leaning slightly against Xavier's solid warmth beside her, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. She felt him stiffen momentarily, then gradually relax. His arm slowly, carefully came around her shoulders, drawing her closer against the night's chill. Rest, he murmured, his voice a low rumble she felt more than heard. I'll keep watch. Francesca woke to Xavier's hand on her shoulder, gently shaking her awake. The forest was still dark, dawn at least an hour away. We need to move, he said quietly, his expression grim. Riders coming up our trail. 6, maybe 7. Fully alert now, Francesca scrambled to her feet. How close? Too close. Must have ridden through the night. Xavier was already gathering their belongings, moving with swift efficiency. We'll leave everything but essentials. Travel lighter, faster. Within minutes, they had saddled the horses and were moving through the pre-dawn forest, Xavier leading the way with unerring confidence despite the darkness. They rode in silence, the only sounds the soft footfalls of their horses and the occasional snap of a twig. As first light began to filter through the trees, Xavier guided them to a rocky outcropping that offered a view of the trail behind them. Drawing his spyglass, he studied their back trail while Francesca anxiously watched his face. 7 riders, he confirmed, his expression hardening. 2 are Blackwater men I recognize from town. The others look like hired guns. Fear coiled in Francesca's stomach. How did they find us? Jensen must have been more certain than we thought, Xavier said, collapsing the spyglass. They're following our trail, but we have a lead. If we push hard, we might lose them in the mountains. They rode recklessly for the next several hours, following game trails and stream beds to obscure their trail. Xavier pushed them up steep inclines and through dense forest where larger groups would struggle to follow quickly. By midday, they had gained considerable distance, but the pace was taking its toll on both them and their horses. We need to rest the animals, Xavier finally said, reining in beside a small stream. Just long enough for them to drink and catch their breath. While the horses drank, Xavier pulled out his map, studying it intently. "There's a settlement about 15 miles ahead, Willow Creek. Small place, but might have a telegraph. We could send for the law in Denver." Francesca shook her head. "They'll have men watching the settlements. It's too risky." Xavier's expression was grim but determined. "Then we keep to the wilderness. There's a pass through these mountains that's treacherous but passable. Might be able to lose them there." They mounted up and continued their flight, the terrain growing increasingly difficult as they climbed higher into the mountains. Pine forests gave way to sparser vegetation and rocky slopes. The air grew thinner, each breath more labored. By late afternoon, they had reached the pass Xavier had mentioned, a narrow defile between towering rock faces, the trail barely wide enough for a single horse. They dismounted to lead their animals through the most treacherous sections, loose shale sliding beneath their feet. "Almost through," Xavier encouraged as they neared the far side. Just another, the crack of a rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, the bullet striking rock near Xavier's head, sending stone chips flying. He shoved Francesca down behind a boulder, drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. "They're above us," he shouted, pointing to the ridge overlooking the pass. 2 more shots rang out, kicking up dust at their feet. Their horses reared in panic, the bay mare breaking free and bolting back the way they had come. Xavier fired 3 quick shots toward the ridge, providing cover as Francesca scrambled deeper behind the boulder. His horse remained tethered but was wild-eyed with fear. "We're pinned down," he said, crouching beside her. "They must have split up, sent men ahead to cut us off." Francesca's heart raced, fear threatening to overwhelm her. "What do we do?" Xavier's face was set in determined lines. "I'll draw their fire. When I do, you take my horse and ride through the pass. Don't stop until you reach Willow Creek." "No," Francesca grabbed his arm. "I won't leave you." "This isn't a debate," Xavier said firmly. "They want you, not me. If we both stay, we both die." "If I go, you die," she countered, tears forming in her eyes. "I won't have that on my conscience." Another volley of shots hit around them, closer this time. Xavier returned fire, then ducked back down, checking his ammunition. 3 bullets left," he muttered. "Not enough to fight our way out." Francesca stared at him, suddenly aware of how much this man had come to mean to her in their short time together. The thought of leaving him to face Franklin's men alone was unbearable. "There has to be another way," she insisted. Xavier was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the pass, calculating. "Maybe," he said finally, "but it's risky. See that slope?" He pointed to a steep incline of loose shale leading up toward the ridgeline where the shooters were positioned. "If I can climb up there, come at them from the side while they're focused on this spot." "That's suicide," Francesca whispered. "So is staying here until they work up the courage to rush us," Xavier countered. "This gives us a chance." Before she could argue further, he pressed his pistol into her hand. 3 shots. Make them count if anyone comes down that pass toward you." He hesitated, then quickly leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Stay alive, Francesca." Then he was gone, scrambling across a short open space to the base of the slope. Bullets kicked up dust around him, but he reached the shelter of a rock outcropping unharmed. From there, he began the treacherous climb, using sparse vegetation and rock formations for cover. Francesca watched, heart in her throat, as Xavier gradually made his way up the near vertical slope. Twice, he dislodged small cascades of shale that threatened to send him tumbling back down, but each time he managed to secure a new handhold. The shooters above seemed unaware of his approach, their attention focused on her position. When Xavier was about halfway up, a shout from the ridgeline indicated he had been spotted. Gunfire erupted, but he had already disappeared behind a fold in the terrain. Francesca held her breath, pistol clutched in white-knuckled hands, waiting. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Then came the sound of gunshots from above, 3 in rapid succession, followed by 2 more. A man's shout, cut off abruptly, more gunfire, scattered and desperate, then nothing. Francesca remained frozen behind her boulder, Xavier's pistol trained on the pass entrance, uncertain whether to hope or despair. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Then a figure appeared on the ridgeline above, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakable even at a distance. "It's clear," Xavier called down, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "They're done." Relief flooded through Francesca with such intensity that her knees nearly buckled. She watched as Xavier made his way carefully down to her position, his shirt torn and bloodied along one sleeve. "You're hurt," she said as he reached her. Xavier glanced at his arm dismissively. "Graze, nothing serious." He took in her tear-streaked face, his expression softening. "It's over, Francesca. There were only 3 of them up there, scouts sent ahead. The main group is still behind us, but we've got time now." Impulsively, Francesca threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. After a moment's hesitation, his arms came around her, holding her tightly. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. Xavier's hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his cheek resting against her short hair. "Takes more than a few hired guns to bring me down," he said, but his light tone couldn't disguise the emotion in his voice. They stood that way for a long moment, hearts racing, before Xavier gently disentangled himself. "We need to move on," he said reluctantly. "Find your mare if we can, then make for Willow Creek. The main group won't be far behind." They found the bay mare grazing peacefully in a meadow a quarter-mile back down the trail, apparently having overcome her fright once clear of the gunfire. With both horses recovered, they made better time through the remainder of the pass, emerging on the other side as twilight began to fall. Xavier set a grueling pace, determined to reach Willow Creek before stopping for the night. When the lights of the small settlement finally appeared in the valley below them, both riders were exhausted, the horses near collapse. Willow Creek proved to be little more than a wide spot in the trail, a general store, a small hotel, a livery, and a handful of cabins clustered around a dusty main street. But it offered what they needed most: safety in numbers and distance from their pursuers. The hotel was a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and sagging steps, but to Francesca, it looked like a palace. Inside, a sleepy-eyed clerk barely glanced up as Xavier requested 2 rooms. "Only got one available," the man drawled. "Trail crews got the rest." Xavier hesitated, glancing at Francesca, who nodded imperceptibly. "One will do," he said, placing coins on the counter. "And we need to send a telegram in the morning. Is there an office in town?" "Store has the wire," the clerk said, pushing a key across the counter. "Opens at 7. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. Xavier stood awkwardly just inside the door after closing it behind them. "I'll take the floor," he said immediately. "You take the bed." Francesca was too exhausted to argue. She sank onto the edge of the mattress while Xavier poured water from a pitcher into the wash basin. "Let me see your arm," she said, noticing the dried blood on his sleeve. Xavier looked as though he might protest, then silently rolled up his sleeve to reveal a shallow gash across his bicep. Francesca dipped a cloth in the water and gently cleaned the wound, conscious of his eyes on her face as she worked. "You could have been killed," she said softly, not looking up from her task. "Wouldn't be the first time I've faced those odds," Xavier replied. "Won't be the last." Francesca's hands stilled. "It was because of me. All of this, you being shot at, hunted, it's all because of me." Xavier's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "It's because of Franklin Blackwater and men like him," he corrected firmly. "Never blame yourself for their actions." She looked up then, meeting his gaze. His face was inches from hers, his gray eyes intense in the lamplight. Something shifted in the air between them, the tension that had been building for days crystallizing into a moment of perfect clarity. "Xavier," she whispered, uncertain what she wanted to say, only knowing that something needed to be acknowledged between them. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of her short hair behind her ear. His hand lingered, gentle against her cheek. "Should rest," he said, his voice rough. "Been a long day." But neither moved. Francesca felt herself leaning slightly forward, drawn by something stronger than exhaustion or fear. Xavier remained perfectly still, his eyes searching hers, questioning. "I'm still married," she whispered, the words both acknowledgement and regret. "I know," he replied simply. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Then Xavier gently withdrew his hand, stepping back with visible reluctance. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll wake you at first light. We can send that telegram, then push on to Denver." Francesca nodded, a confusing mixture of relief and disappointment washing through her. She watched as Xavier arranged his bedroll on the floor, then turned to give her privacy as she prepared for bed. Later, lying in the darkness with Xavier's steady breathing the only sound in the room, Francesca stared at the ceiling, her thoughts in turmoil. Franklin seemed increasingly distant, a nightmare from another life. The woman who had married him felt like a stranger now, naive and desperate for security at any cost. The woman she was becoming stronger, more certain of herself, was drawn to the quiet, honorable man sleeping on the hard floor beside her bed. A man who had risked his life for her without hesitation or expectation, who had shown her kindness when she most needed it. But the law bound her to Franklin, and Xavier was a man who respected boundaries, even when they stood between him and what he wanted. That he wanted her, Francesca no longer doubted. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in his careful restraint. The question that kept her awake long into the night was simpler. What did she want, and did she have the courage to claim it? Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through the threadbare curtains. Xavier was already awake, his bedroll neatly packed, when Francesca opened her eyes. "Ready to send that telegram?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, as though the charged moment between them had never occurred. Francesca nodded, gathering her composure as she rose from the bed. "What exactly are we going to say?" "Help, my husband's men are trying to kill us," seems unlikely to prompt immediate action. A ghost of a smile touched Xavier's lips. "I know a man in Denver, former marshal. If anyone can help, it's him." They breakfasted quickly at the hotel, then walked to the general store where the telegraph was located. Xavier composed a brief message. "Joshua Reed, Denver, traveling with F, who needs protection from abusive husband being pursued. Stop, arrive 2 days. Stop, legal help required. Stop, X Young," while the telegrapher tapped out the message. Xavier and Francesca restocked their supplies, purchasing food, ammunition, and a new shirt for Xavier to replace his blood-stained one. "Your friend?" Francesca asked as they loaded their saddlebags. "Can he really help me legally?" Xavier nodded. "Reed knows every judge and lawyer worth knowing in Colorado. If anyone can find a way to free you from your marriage, it's him." The thought of being truly free legally, not just physically distant from Franklin, made Francesca's heart beat faster. "Even without Franklin's consent, there are grounds for dissolution," Xavier said carefully. "Abandonment, cruelty, with witnesses, evidence." He trailed off, his expression darkening. "The bruises have healed, but Reed will know people who can testify to what such injuries look like, how they happen. As they prepared to leave Willow Creek, the telegrapher ran out to the hitching post where they were mounting their horses. "Message for Young," the man called, waving a yellow paper. Xavier took the telegram, reading it quickly before passing it to Francesca. "X will meet you Butterfield Station. Stop bringing Judge Parker. Stop hold course. Stop Reed. Who's Judge Parker?" Francesca asked, returning the telegram. "Toughest judge in the territory," Xavier replied, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "And a man who believes wives aren't property." They rode out of Willow Creek with renewed determination, following a well-traveled road that wound down from the mountains toward the plains where Denver lay. The terrain became gentler, the forests giving way to rolling grasslands dotted with farms and small settlements. That evening, they stopped at a farmhouse where an elderly couple allowed them to sleep in their barn in exchange for Xavier chopping wood. It was the first time since leaving the Blackwater ranch that Francesca had interacted with ordinary people going about their lives, and the normality of it was both strange and comforting. After a simple dinner shared with their hosts, Xavier and Francesca retreated to the barn, where clean straw and horse blankets made a comfortable enough bed. Unlike the close confines of the hotel room, the spacious barn allowed them to maintain a respectful distance, something Francesca found herself both appreciating and regretting. "One more day to Butterfield Station," Xavier said as they settled in for the night. "From there, it's just a few hours to Denver by stage." "And then?" Francesca asked, voicing the question that had hung between them all day. Xavier was silent for a long moment, his face half hidden in shadow. "Then you'll be safe. Reed and Parker will help you start a new life, free from Blackwater. And you," she pressed. "What will you do?" he shrugged, the movement barely visible in the dim light. "Still have that business to finish after that, don't know." Francesca studied him across the space between their makeshift beds. "You never really answered before when I asked if you thought people could truly change." Xavier sighed, shifting to face her more directly. "Maybe I didn't answer because I don't know. For a long time I believed I was what circumstances made me a fighter, a loner, someone who didn't need connections." He paused. "Not sure that's true anymore." "What changed?" Francesca asked softly, though she thought she knew the answer. Xavier held her gaze, his eyes reflecting what little light filtered through the barn's windows. "Met someone who made me think about more than the next job, the next trail." He hesitated. "Someone who made me want to be better than I am." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep inside her. Without conscious thought, Francesca found herself moving across the space between them, kneeling beside his blanket. "You're already a good man, Xavier Young," she said quietly. "The best I've known." Xavier's hand reached up, hesitant, to touch her cheek. Francesca, whatever he meant to say, was lost as she leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, questioning, giving him every chance to pull away. He didn't. Instead, his hand slipped into her hair, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. Francesca felt herself melting into him, all the fear and tension of the past weeks dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "We shouldn't," he murmured, though his hand still cradled her head. "I know," Francesca whispered back, "but I needed to know to feel what might be possible. After." Xavier drew back slightly to look into her eyes. "After," he repeated, the word both promise and restraint. They slept that night side by side, not touching save for their hands, fingers intertwined in the space between them. It was both too much and not enough, but it was all they could allow themselves with honor. The road to Butterfield Station took them through increasingly settled country. Farms gave way to small towns, the wilderness receding behind them with each mile. By mid-afternoon of the following day, they crested a rise and saw their destination spread below them, a substantial settlement centered around a stage station, with a hotel, several saloons, and even a small church. As they rode down the main street, Francesca found herself scanning the boardwalks nervously, half expecting to see Franklin or his men lurking in wait. Xavier seemed similarly vigilant, his posture tense, his hand never far from his holster. They stopped first at the telegraph office, where a message from Reed awaited. "Arriving noon tomorrow. Stop. Secure rooms at Western Hotel. Stop. Reed." "We made it," Francesca said, relief evident in her voice as they exited the office. "We actually made it." Xavier's smile was cautious. "Not completely safe until Reed gets here with the judge, but yes, we've outrun them for now." They secured rooms at the Western Hotel, adjoining rooms this time, with a connecting door that they left slightly ajar by mutual, unspoken agreement. After the dust of travel was washed away, they ventured downstairs for a proper meal in the hotel dining room, their first since leaving San Francisco, Francesca realized with a start. Seated across from Xavier at a small table, watching him awkwardly navigate the niceties of restaurant dining, Francesca was struck by how comfortable she felt in his presence. There was none of the tension she had experienced with Franklin, no fear of saying the wrong thing or disappointing him somehow. "What?" Xavier asked, noticing her thoughtful gaze. "Just thinking how different this is," she explained. "Being here with you, it's easy somehow." Xavier's expression softened. "Being with you has been the easiest thing I've done in years," he admitted quietly, "which makes what comes next all the harder." Francesca's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Xavier glanced around the crowded dining room, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "When Reed gets here, when you're safe legally, I still have to find that lawyer, finish what I started." "I know," Francesca said, though the thought of him leaving sent a chill through her. "I told you I want to help with that." Xavier shook his head firmly. "It could be dangerous. The man I'm looking for, my sister's husband, he has connections, money. I won't put you at risk." "I've been at risk since the day I met you," Francesca pointed out. "That hasn't stopped me yet." A reluctant smile tugged at Xavier's lips. "Stubborn woman." "You have no idea," she replied, returning his smile. They retired early, exhaustion from their journey catching up with them. In the privacy of her room, Francesca found herself drawn to the connecting door, listening to the sounds of Xavier moving about on the other side. It would be so easy to push it open, to step through, to ask for what she wanted. Instead, she turned away, reminding herself of the complications that still stood between them. Tomorrow would bring Reed and the judge, the beginning of her legal battle for freedom. Until that was resolved, anything more between her and Xavier would only add unnecessary complexity to an already difficult situation. Still, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, Francesca allowed herself to imagine a future where such complications no longer existed. A future where she was free to choose her own path, to love whom she wished. A future, perhaps, with the quiet, honorable man in the next room. Morning brought nervous anticipation. Francesca dressed carefully in the cleanest of her travel clothes, wishing for something more presentable to meet the judge who might hold her future in his hands. Xavier seemed similarly on edge, pacing their adjoining rooms, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. "Reed said noon," he reminded her for perhaps the third time. "Stage should be right on schedule if the weather holds." At 11:45, they made their way to the stage station, positioning themselves on the boardwalk with a clear view of the arriving coach. Precisely at noon, The stage rolled in with a clatter of hooves and creaking leather, dust billowing from beneath its wheels. Xavier straightened as the door opened and a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s descended. The newcomer spotted them immediately, a wide smile breaking across his weathered face. "Young, you old wolf," he called, striding forward to clasp Xavier's hand and pound his shoulder. "Still finding trouble wherever you go, I see." Xavier's reserve melted slightly in the face of his friend's warmth. "Raid, good to see you." Reed turned his attention to Francesca, his keen eyes taking in her fading bruises with professional assessment. "And this must be the lady in need of assistance." "Joshua Raid, madam, at your service." Before Francesca could respond, a second man emerged from the stage, older, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes beneath bushy brows. He carried himself with unmistakable authority, his black suit immaculate despite the rigors of stage travel. "Judge Parker," Xavier said respectfully, extending his hand. The judge nodded, his handshake firm. "Young, Reed has told me some disturbing things about this lady's situation. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." They returned to the hotel, gathering in Xavier's room where Reed and the judge listened intently as Francesca recounted her marriage to Franklin, the abuse she had suffered, and their journey to Colorado. Xavier added details where needed, his quiet presence beside her a source of strength. When she finished, Judge Parker's expression was grave. "Mrs. Blackwater, Harlow," Francesca interrupted. "I prefer my maiden name." The judge inclined his head. "Miss Harlow, then. What you've described constitutes extreme cruelty under the law. Colorado Territory has more progressive statutes regarding dissolution of marriage than Wyoming, particularly in cases of abuse. However, we would normally require documentation, witnesses." "Which we don't have," Xavier said, frustration evident in his voice. "Not entirely true," Reed interjected. "I took the liberty of wiring a colleague in Riverton after receiving your telegram. Seems the Blackwaters aren't as well loved as they believe. Found a doctor who treated Miss Harlow once after a fall who's willing to testify he didn't believe her injuries matched the story." Hope flared in Francesca's chest. "Dr. Miller. He was kind to me, but I never thought he suspected," Reed confirmed. "Couldn't prove anything but kept notes. And there's a housekeeper who left their employ recently, claims she witnessed Franklin striking you." Judge Parker nodded thoughtfully. "Sworn affidavits from these witnesses, combined with your testimony and the visible evidence of abuse Mr. Young can attest to having seen. It might be enough." "Might?" Xavier questioned sharply. The judge fixed him with a stern look. "The law is imperfect, Mr. Young, as you well know. But I am inclined to rule favorably in this case, particularly given the circumstances of Miss Harlow's flight, and the fact that armed men pursued her across territorial lines." Reed cleared his throat. "There's another complication. Got word this morning that Franklin Blackwater himself crossed into Colorado 2 days ago, heading this way with several men." Francesca felt the blood drain from her face. Xavier's hand found hers, squeezing reassuringly. "How did he know we'd come here?" she whispered. "May not know specifically," Reed replied. "But Denver's the logical destination for anyone fleeing Wyoming, big enough to disappear in, far enough to be beyond his immediate influence." Judge Parker's bushy eyebrows drew together. "This changes matters. If Blackwater arrives before we can convene a proper hearing, he'll force me to return with him," Francesca finished, her voice steady despite her fear. "Or worse." Xavier stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "We could leave now, head further south, New Mexico maybe." Reed shook his head. "Running won't solve the legal problem. Miss Harlow would still be his wife, still legally bound to him. Then we accelerate the proceedings," Judge Parker decided, rising to his feet with surprising energy for a man his age. I came prepared to hear this case, and hear it I shall today, now in this very room if necessary. Is that legal? Francesca asked, hardly daring to hope. The judge's smile was grim. I am the circuit court in this region, Miss Harlow. Where I sit is the court. Reed, you have those affidavits. Reed patted his breast pocket. Right here. For the next 2 hours, Judge Parker conducted what he termed a special emergency hearing, with Reed acting as Francesca's attorney and the hotel room serving as their courtroom. Francesca testified in detail about the abuse she had suffered, while Xavier recounted finding her beaten unconscious and their subsequent journey. Reed presented the affidavits he had obtained, along with documentation of Franklin's unsavory business dealings that suggested a pattern of disregard for law and basic humanity. Throughout it all, Judge Parker listened intently, occasionally asking penetrating questions that forced Francesca to relive painful memories. Finally, as afternoon light slanted through the hotel window, the judge cleared his throat. Having heard all testimony and reviewed the evidence presented, I am prepared to rule. He turned to Francesca, his expression solemn. Miss Harlow, the territory of Colorado grants you a dissolution of your marriage to Franklin Blackwater on grounds of extreme cruelty and abandonment. A sob escaped Francesca's throat, part relief, part disbelief. Xavier's hand found hers again, his grip tight. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am issuing a writ of protection, forbidding Blackwater from approaching or communicating with you in any way. Should he attempt to do so, he will be subject to immediate arrest. He paused, his voice softening slightly. You are free, young lady, legally and completely free. Reed clapped his hands together once, beaming. Well done, Parker. Never known you to move so quickly. The judge harumphed, gathering his papers. Justice delayed is justice denied, particularly when the party seeking justice is in imminent danger. He fixed Xavier with a pointed look. I assume you'll continue to ensure Miss Harlow's safety until Blackwater is made aware of these proceedings. Xavier nodded, his expression determined. With my life, if necessary. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Reed said dryly. I'll wire the sheriff in Butterfield to be on the lookout for Blackwater and his men, and we should get Miss Harlow to Denver as soon as possible, more protection there. As Reed and the judge made their preparations to leave, Francesca sat in stunned silence, the reality of her freedom slowly sinking in. No longer Francesca Blackwater, no longer bound to a man who had treated her as property, who had stood by while his family brutalized her. Free to choose her own path forward, free to choose. Her eyes found Xavier, who stood by the window, his profile outlined against the late afternoon light. He had been her rescuer, her protector, her friend, and perhaps, if she was brave enough to claim it, something more. The stage leaves for Denver at 8 tomorrow morning, Reed announced, breaking into her thoughts. Judge Parker and I will be on it. I've reserved seats for both of you as well. Xavier turned from the window. We'll be there. After Reed and the judge departed, promising to meet them at the stage in the morning, Francesca and Xavier found themselves alone together for the first time since the hearing began. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken words, possibilities suddenly opened by the judge's ruling. You're free, Xavier said simply, his voice rough with emotion. Francesca nodded, still processing the reality of it. Thanks to you. If you hadn't found me that night, you would have found another way, Xavier said with quiet certainty. You're stronger than you know. She smiled at his faith in her, then hesitated, gathering courage for the question that had been building since the judge pronounced her free. What happens now, Xavier? With us? Xavier's expression was carefully neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. What do you want to happen? Francesca began, then stopped, reconsidering. No, that's not right. For too long I've thought about what others want from me, what I should be for them. It's time I decided what I want for myself. She took a deep breath. I want to go to Denver to start building a life of my own. I want to draw again, maybe open a shop someday where I can create beautiful things. Xavier nodded, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Denver's a good place for that. And I want you in that life, Francesca continued, her voice gaining strength. Not as my rescuer or protector, but as my partner, if that's what you want too. The careful neutrality slipped from Xavier's expression, replaced by a vulnerability she had rarely glimpsed. Are you sure? You've just gained your freedom. Might want to enjoy it before. Francesca closed the distance between them, placing her fingers gently against his lips to silence him. My freedom means I get to choose, she said softly. And I choose you, Xavier Young, if you'll have me. For answer, Xavier gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held none of the hesitation of their first. This was certainty, promise, a future opening before them. When they finally parted, Xavier kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. Still have that business in Denver, he reminded her. Finding the lawyer seeking justice for my sister could be dangerous. Then we'll face it together, Francesca said firmly. I'm not afraid anymore, not with you. Xavier smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his face. Stubborn woman. You have no idea, she replied, returning his smile before drawing him down for another kiss. They never saw Franklin Blackwater again. Whether Reed's warning to the local sheriff deterred him, or word of the judge's ruling reached him on the trail, he turned back to Wyoming without entering Butterfield Station. Later, they would hear that his family's fortunes took a downturn after several business associates, learning of his treatment of his wife, withdrew their support. Denver proved to be everything Francesca had hoped, a bustling city of opportunity where her skills as a seamstress were in high demand. With Reed's help, she found work at an upscale dressmaker's shop catering to the wives of the city's growing elite. Xavier's search for the lawyer who had evidence against his sister's husband ended more conclusively than he had dared hope. The man not only had preserved testimony from witnesses who had seen the abuse, but had uncovered financial records suggesting her death had been deliberate rather than accidental. Armed with this evidence, and with Judge Parker's assistance, Xavier finally achieved the justice he had sought for so long. His sister's husband was tried and convicted. Not of murder, the evidence wasn't quite strong enough for that, but of financial crimes that would keep him imprisoned for many years. With that chapter of his life closed, Xavier found himself truly free for the first time since his sister's death. Free to consider a future beyond the next job, the next trail. Free to accept the position Reed offered him as a special investigator for the territorial court's work that utilized his tracking skills, but kept him based primarily in Denver. 6 months after their arrival in the city, Xavier and Francesca were married in a simple ceremony with Reed and Judge Parker as witnesses. They purchased a modest house on the outskirts of town, with enough land for Xavier's horses and a small studio where Francesca could pursue her renewed passion for drawing and design. A year later, their son was born, James Reed Young, named for Xavier's father and the friend who had helped secure their future together. As Xavier held his son for the first time, gazing down at the tiny face that somehow combined his features with Francesca's, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed since that night on the Wyoming plains when he had found a beaten woman lying in the dust. "What are you thinking?" Francesca asked, watching him from the bed, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. Xavier carefully sat beside her, their son cradled in his arms. "Thinking about all the ways a life can change in an instant," he said quietly. "How a single decision can lead to." He glanced down at their child, then back to her, words failing him. Francesca reached up to touch his cheek, understanding in her eyes. "To everything that matters," she finished for him. As twilight deepened outside their window, casting the room in soft shadow, Xavier Young realized he had finally found the peace that had eluded him for so long. Not in revenge or justice, necessary though those had been, but in the quiet miracle of family in the woman who had chosen him freely and completely, and in the child who represented all their hopes for the future. "To everything that matters," he agreed, leaning down to kiss his wife as their son slept peacefully between them, secure in the knowledge that he would grow up surrounded by love, strength, and the freedom to become whoever he was meant to be.